Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, which is brought to you with generous support from SAGE, we're going to be talking about fake news and its impact on science and democracy. This one goes out to all the fans of InfoLit and, well, critical thinking. It seems like it wasn't that long ago that many of us were even barely aware that we were developing our critical thinking skills while we're in college. Now, critical thinking has become a more voluntary exercise, a skill that we suddenly appreciate having, and one, it seems, that might just save democracy itself. And those of you who are currently in college are receiving very intentional, purposeful instruction around critical thinking. Is this focus because of digital technology, business practices from mainstream and fringe media outlets, the breakdown of political norms, or all of the above and then some? Joining me to answer these questions in this four-part series are Dan Chibnall and Nick Anstead. Dan is a STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University, and Nick is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Both guests teach and write about misinformation and fake news in STEM and the social sciences. In this first episode, we're going to meet our guests and interrogate the meaning of the term fake news and its origins. Okay, Dan and Nick, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bill.
Sure. Why don't we start with introductions? Can each of you just briefly describe your current roles in research? And Dan, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So my name is Dan Chibnall. I am the STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, in the USA. I teach courses on science communication, misinformation, and the relationship between science and democracy, as well as a course on the relationship between science fiction and science. And my research is mainly on how to make science more accessible to wider audiences, working both with K-12 students as well as college students.
Okay, and Nick, over to you.
My name's Nick Anstead, and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics, and I'm also the director of our master's programme in politics and communication. And in terms of my research, I write a lot about election campaigns and political communication and the role of information in those processes. And I'm particularly interested in new media, but also how the newer media environment interacts with more traditional political institutions. So things like electoral regulators or political parties.
Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to be talking about fake news and misinformation. And so I'm curious to see how you each define fake news. I think it's kind of evolved as a term in the last 10 years or so, and it's kind of become a blanket term for a lot of things. So Nick, why don't we start with you? What are the various elements at play here within the term fake news?
So I think one thing I would say straight away when we think about fake news is we often tend to think of it as being content. I guess this is quite often bundled up in the idea of misinformation. So we tend to think of it as being stories that are untrue. But I think in my work, I've been keen to come up with a broader definition, which is much more about the type of environment in which information circulates. And particularly to think about who do we believe information from, and what institutions do we give authority to essentially define what we think of as being true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you start to think of it in that terms, then you end up with something that's much broader and something that's more about the type of changing information environment we all have to exist in as citizens today.
Okay. Can you kind of give us a little bit of an example of that?
Yeah, so I guess the way I would think about it is kind of a temporal definition, in the sense of if you go back to an earlier period of time, maybe what people who research media and communications would think of as the broadcast era, rather than the more decentralized information era we exist in today. You had maybe more of a journalistic elite in terms of a few national broadcasters, a few newspapers, whether they were national or regional, depending on the particular media environment you were in. But with that environment came a particular type of authority in terms of how people got information and who they believed to actually disseminate that information. Obviously, the environment we exist in today is radically different in terms both of the authority we give to those institutions, because many of them still exist, right? In the UK, we still have the BBC, you still have those big newspapers, but their authority is, I would say, considerably diminished. And they have to exist in this much more porous and complex information environment where they're more likely to be challenged, or there are countervailing pieces of information or narratives circulating.
Excellent, thank you. And then, Dan, you're clearly coming at this, within a scientific and science context. Where do you situate the term fake news in all of that?
Yeah, I think that we've had the concept of fake news for a long time as a species, in the way we communicate with each other,
Hmm.
especially, culturally. But it isn't until we had the technology to sort of accelerate our modes of information creation and retrieval, and being able to push out information at such a rapid level that it is now probably a bigger problem than it's ever been. And so I think it's, from a science perspective, technology really helped to put misinformation, fake news, whatever you want to call it, way up there as a much larger social problem, not just in the United States or the UK, but globally. And when I try to define it, with my students, I try to get them to think about it not just as like one gigantic umbrella term, but to think about it that it runs on a spectrum. You know, technically satire is fake news, right? But that's not the same thing as, say, a Russian propaganda poster that might be hung by somebody in Kyiv who is sympathetic to that side of the conflict, right? Those are two entirely different things, even though they're both false.
Hmm.
So I think it's really important when we're defining fake news that we unpack it and identify what type of lie or what type of deception or just what type of, BS it is, because
Hmm.
it just, they all exist in various different ways and have different purposes and different agendas. But at the root of it all, I see the main problem as coming from technology. Technology accelerates this problem. It's always been there. It's just moving at a much faster clip now.
Excellent. Um, and just kind of hanging on the term fake news for a little bit more, do you both think that's even the correct term? I mean, it sounds like uh, it depends on the situation, kind of thing. And Dan, why don't we stay with you for that for a second?
Yeah, I try not to use it, and I don't think it's a great idea to use it. I mean, you can use it to help a lay audience identify, okay, we're going to talk about fake news, right? You can start the conversation that way to open it up, right?
Right.
But beyond that, it's really important to, because I think honestly, I think it's sort of a lazy term because it tries to throw a whole bunch of things into one pot.
Hmm.
And so I think it's important that people understand how to identify, say, the differences between a piece of misinformation, which is just bad information that's suddenly gotten thrown, onto social media. Maybe the person who put it out there had no mal intent. They were just making a joke or something. They were just, throwing something around and boom, it accelerates, right? So there's no ill intent there. But disinformation is totally different, right? This is the same kind of idea, but pushed out with much more, malice or some sort of an agenda, be it political, economic, social, whatever it might be. I think that's the key thing, is helping people understand that there are different categories of this. And yeah, it's not always easy to, you're not going to stop what you're doing. Like you're listening to the news and chopping an onion for dinner, and you're not going to stop and be like, oh, let me go search for that real quick and see what type of fake news it is. You're not going to do that, but you can at least build mental habits to sort of identify in your mind, like, hold up, wait a second, what is that? Right.
Hmm.
So I think it's important to categorize it.
Excellent. And then Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
well, I should declare a vested interest because I wrote a whole book trying to rehabilitate the term fake news. So
Right.
I think, look, I completely see why the term has become problematic, and it's become problematic because it seems to have developed two diametrically opposed uses in contemporary political culture. So the first use is, let's call it with a small L, the liberal use of the term, which is a concern about misinformation, a concern that it's very hard for citizens to make informed choices when they can't sift through what is true and what is not. But then simultaneously, it's become a term used by some populist politicians to attack the very institutions that are supposed to hold them to account. And these diametrically opposed uses have led to some people saying, "Well, we shouldn't use this term. It's not very useful at this point." But I would go back to a question which I don't think academics ask often enough. Well, what is it we're trying to do when we're defining a term? And actually, there are different ways of defining a term. So one is the kind of exclusionary definition. We say these things are a certain things and these things aren't. But and that's useful and it has its function. And I guess you see that most obviously in things like fact checking, where they're trying to say this story is fake and this story isn't fake.
Right.
But I think a much more interesting definitional approach is to think about those seemingly diametrically opposed uses of the term and ask why at this historic moment they have emerged. And again, I would come back at that point to the institutional answer in the sense that the weaknesses of those institutions, those news agencies that are concerned about fake news, those traditional purveyors of information who say this phenomenon is a really bad thing, this is also leaving open space where those populist politicians can attack them. And so these seemingly diametric uses of the term actually do sit together in terms of the historical moment we are in. And on that basis, I think there is value in the term.
Excellent. Thank you. So, kind of following on that, and we'll stay with you, Nick, for a bit. How do we situate fake news in today's social climate at this historical moment, as you say? In what ways does the context contribute to fake news's characteristics?
I think this is such an important question because I think there is a tendency, and we've seen this in lots of places around the world, to situate explanations for large political events in the context of more narrowly fake news, more broadly informational and communication phenomena. Uh, but I think what I would say is that beyond that, there are a host of other explanations that are explaining why at this historical moment we have to deal with this problem. And let me give you a few of those. So one of them, it seems pretty striking in lots of countries, is you're having a decline of the traditional party system. So in lots of countries, you're seeing new parties emerging. Often these are populist parties. These are on the radical right or the radical left, and they have a different relationship with information to traditional political parties. You're also arguably seeing a new political economy emerging. So it's, I think, very hard for traditional social democratic parties, traditional Christian democratic parties, to provide the kinds of answers that they were able to give in the post-war period. And if you think about lots of countries, what you saw in the post-war decades was pretty stable economic growth, which allowed those parties to actually offer different distinctive platforms. In the absence of that economic growth, they have a problem. And I mean, let's take the example of social democratic parties, right? What are they for when they can't offer, for example, better social services, better public services? And into that vacuum, you're finding purveyors of different sorts of political answers entering that space. And very often, these are the kind of political actors who are peddling misinformation or what we could term fake news. So you've got a very different type of political competition in this environment. And often it's linked to the failure of traditional parties and the breakdown of that system that had organized politics for long periods of time.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Nick. And then Dan, I suppose there's an equally nuanced set of contextual influences in the field of science that kind of influences how we situate fake news. I mean, can you talk about that as well?
Sure. One of the problems when you look at it through a scientific lens, for example, look at the global pandemic. Here is a time where we have an opportunity for our experts and the people who have been studying these things for decades to step up and to inform the public about what is happening and about how the technology that we have will yield a solution and preventative measures. And it all looks so nice and neat on paper and on your screen. And then what we saw was only a thimble of that, and a lot of the rest of the stuff was misinformation and fear. And yes, emotion played a huge role in propagating fake news, misinformation, disinformation during the pandemic. But at the same time, even without the fear there, it became a politicized thing, and it almost became. And this kind of comes back to what I was talking about earlier with this whole technology accelerates some of these problems, that people start to almost become tribal, or they start to look for symbols of things around them that will help them feel safe. And so, for some people, that was a mask because they understood that it was scientifically grounded and a way to stay safe and a way to help others stay safe. But for other people, they didn't necessarily want to look at the science, or the science was fake. The science was spun up by politicians, and these people on TV. And now that doesn't matter anymore. I'm not going to wear that because it's a symbol of the other side, right?
Yeah.
And so what you have is you get lost. Now it doesn't even matter what the facts are, what the science says. You now have this accelerated symbolism problem, and that's what people are going to follow. So unless you have really good communicators to get this stuff out there that makes sense in an easy way, people are going to revert back to looking for the people that are in their tribe and in their social group.
You just heard from Dan Chibnall, STEM librarian and associate professor of librarianship at Drake University, and Nick Anstead, associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. This episode was brought to you with generous support from Sage. Join us next week when we talk about how the information landscape has evolved in ways that both amplify fake news and combat it. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer and digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.